Gender role. A theoretical construct in the social sciences and humanities that refers to a set of social and behavioral norms that, within a specific culture, are widely considered to be socially appropriate for individuals of a specific gender. For the majority of history, specific gender roles existed and changed little throughout the years. The man acted as the breadwinner and head of the household, controlling most aspects of his family's lives. The woman, oppositely, acted as the housekeeper and property of her husband, a dependent functioning to keep order. Early challenges to these stigmas took place, but failed to gain much popularity and positive public recognition. Real changes began to occur in the late 19th and early 20th century, particularly in the United States and Europe. However, the tumultuous events of the feminism many people in America are familiar with did not truly begin until the 60s and 70s, at about the time when Raymond Carver wrote and published Will You Please Be Quiet, Please? In the time period of 1966 to 1976, the year the book was published, the bra burning at the Miss America pageant, Roe v. Wade, Eisenstadt v. Baird, right to contraceptives, the approval of Equal Pay Act and Title IX, the founding of NOW, National Organization for Women, and the implementation of the first mutual no-fault divorce laws and the marital rape laws all took place, among many other changes that forever transformed gender relations and society in general. A woman holding a job and providing for her family, something just years before that was unheard of, began integrating into American society. The legislation, movements, and changes, all fiercely controversial, represented extremely hot topics in the world that Carver lived and worked in. Many opposed and vied for traditional roles to return, while others worked for and embraced the changes. In his short story collection, Will You Please Be Quiet, Please?, Carver addresses these contentious culture shifts and produces commentary on their effect on modern-day society. Particularly in the stories What Is It and They're Not Your Husband, Carver, through an array of literary features, depicts the growing commonality of non-traditional gender roles and defends them, arguing that they derive from the pressures of the time period society and represent a natural part of a developing culture. Carver, in the story What Is It?, utilizes characterization to demonstrate changing gender roles and illustrate their necessity in certain situations. The story tells of a struggling lower-class couple, Tony and Leo. Leo convinces Tony to try and sell their car to make money. Tony ends up on a wild escapade that she returns from at dawn, disheveled but successful in selling the car. From the beginning of the dialogue with her husband, Carver paints Tony as a woman in charge. "You're making me nervous," she says. "I wish you wouldn't just stand there and tell me how I look. Your credit's lousy. You're nothing." Tony, acting very out of character in terms of a traditional woman, seems to command the relationship, exuding nothing but confidence and independence. The masculinity of her name, coupled with her mannerisms and background as a working woman, further illustrate her as a woman not dependent on a man. Carver holds this image of Tony through the rest of the story, especially when describing her shopping habits. Tony would go to the grocery store and put everything she saw. "I had to do it without when I was a kid," she says. "These kids are not going to do without." From the tone and authority of this selection, the reader gains the notion that Tony runs the relationship and family, which is traditionally the man's job. Leo remains passive and refused to challenge Tony. This characterization that Carver implements explicitly demonstrates the shifting gender roles common in Carver's time. The male represents a less authoritative figure, and the woman maintains increased independence and importance. Tony's empowered nature most directly comes from her situation. She, as a lower-class economically struggling woman, attempts to salvage her family's credit by utilizing her previous skills as a saleswoman. She never tries to explicitly dominate her husband, but solely aspires to help provide her children with a life better than her own. Carver's placement of a character like Tony in this specific situation works to demonstrate that pressures to survive take over, and a woman like her find themselves needing to support the ones they love. The characterization of Tony, strong and independent, and the creation of a real-world situation provide Carver with a tool to defend the sometimes unpopular gender role revolution. In addition to characterization, Carver employs pathos for Leo to further illustrate the shifting of societal gender norms and reinforce his defense of the changes. As Tony works to try and sell her car, Leo remains at home in a panic of sorts. He stares at the screen and sips, and soon he goes for another drink. He sits again. A news program begins. It's 10 o'clock, and he says, "God, what in God's name has gone wrong?" and goes to the kitchen to return with more scotch. Carver depicts Leo as helpless and fretful, waiting on his wife. The traditional man in a relationship, self-regulating and not dependent on the wife, definitely fails to appear in the pathos Carver creates, thus highlighting a change from societal norms. Leo remains waiting on his wife while she parades around on her own terms. In previous times, the relationship and dynamic that appears in Leo and Tony's relationship would receive disdain to the highest degree in society. But no such reprehension occurs. Carver perpetuates Leo's pathos as Tony refuses to return home. "Where are you, honey? Honey?" "What?" "Please, honey, come home. Take a cab and come home." The dialogue, filled with begging and pleading from Leo, creates sympathy and pity for Leo as he appears feeble and vulnerable, unable to reason with his wife. The situation created by Carver is very ironic because one expects the wife to beseech the husband and not the other way around. Carver, effectively and intentionally, portrays this pathos to further the notion of changing societal gender roles. Additionally, the pathos bolsters his argument in favor of the definition of new gender roles. Leo, unable to function and emotionally distressed, resonates as an unreliable and pitiful character, incapable of taking charge in his life. This impression leads the reader to support Tony's actions in taking control of her family's situation. Carver, in addition to the characterization, implements the pathos to reinforce the notion that evolving gender roles correspond to a natural and necessary change in the time period society. In They're Not Your Husband, Carver utilizes the juxtaposition of the motif of job interviews and the motif of the diner to portray the modern transformation of gender roles and underpin his justification of it. This tale focuses on another struggling couple, Doreen and Earl, and Earl's reaction to comments he overhears about his wife's weight. Earl, a down-on-his-luck salesman, interviews for jobs throughout the duration of the story. He read the classifieds. He went to the state employment office. Every 3 or 4 days he drove someplace for an interview, and at night he counted her tips. Constant and frequent, the job interviews clearly display Earl's unemployment to the reader, effectively communicating that he fails to provide for his family. Doreen, oppositely, enjoys the monotony of a stable job throughout the story. Doreen spent much more time in bed now. She went back to bed after the children left for school, and she napped in the afternoons before going to work. In the description of this daily routine, she appears lazy, but in actuality, pressures from her husband to lose weight and her daily work shift exhaust her. Doreen works while Earl looks for a job and counts her money. This juxtaposition utilized by Carver illustrates the switching of gender roles as Doreen labors for the family and Earl participates more domestically. Furthermore, the juxtaposition provides the same effect as the pathos in What Is It? The reader recognizes that Earl's unemployment creates unpredictable times for the family, and Doreen's job manages to keep them somewhat stable. Again, she desires not to upstage Earl, but simply to keep her family out of extreme poverty. Carver's creation of the unstable economic situation, coupled with the juxtaposition, shows how new roles for a husband and wife are sometimes the only option and subsequently defends changing gender norms. Carver, carefully and adeptly, characterizes Earl to further his portrayal of the gender role revolution present in his world. In conversation with his wife, Earl appears as a man who lost control of his family and patriarchal role. "Any chance of you know?" he said to her and winked. "No," she said. "Don't talk to me now. I'm busy." Traditionally, in terms of gender roles, the man commands respect and submission from his wife, and this clearly fails to occur in the case of Earl. The reader recognizes that he does not have the control a traditional husband would yield over his wife. Furthermore, Earl attempts to regain authority, but in the process displaces from his conventional male role. Earl helped around the house, watched television, and let her sleep. He did all the shopping, and once in a while he went on an interview. One night he put the children to bed, turned off the television, and decided to go for a few drinks. Carver, as the story progresses, blatantly begins to depict Earl as a customary wife, illustrating that the situation developed in the story renders him less traditionally masculine. In effect, the characterization of Earl in They're Not Your Husband reflects the theme of the alteration of typical gender roles in society. The characterization, connoting a servant, further bolsters the notion that the cultural gender norm transformation signifies an indispensable change in the time period society. The reader recognizes Earl as a dependent trying to regain control and a person incapable of supporting his family. Essentially, Earl acts as a foil for Doreen, demonstrating her new obligations to provide because he, rendered incapable by unemployment, no longer fulfills the responsibilities thrust upon him by societal gender norms. Carver exploits the characterization of Earl to further defend the evolution of cultural gender norms as a byproduct of societal pressures in difficult situations. For the duration of Will You Please Be Quiet, Please, Raymond Carver portrays the transformation of gender roles in modern-day society, specifically during the 1960s to 1970s, through many stories and literary devices. He additionally justifies the change of roles as a necessary development in an advancing society. Many of the stories highlight the growing independence of women and decreasing dominance of men that began unfolding in Carver's day. Both of the couples in the stories What Is It and They're Not Your Husband live and work in situations that cause them to deviate from their traditional responsibilities as men and women. Carver's depiction of the characters through the literary features outlined builds and illustrates their reactions to the societal and emotional pressures they experience daily. Toni, proud and dominant, draws on her background in sales to take over in reconciling her and Leo's bankruptcy, and exerts a certain degree of control because of Leo's lack of knowledge in the situation. Earl, frustratingly, feels a lack of control in his life as he is not the provider for his family. His attempts to regain control work against him, eventually inadvertently leading to Doreen's stable position as the breadwinner and a demise of his patriarchal position. In these stories, Carver mimics real life and the conditions many people unfortunately find themselves thrust into. The adoption of more equal societal gender roles that began in Carver's day assists in the evasion of poverty and persists in providing more opportunities for people everywhere, making these circumstances more bearable for those involved. These situations and actions demonstrate that many different events culminate to progress and transform gender roles, and that as society progresses, the way humans interact and the roles they fill ultimately progress as well.